I'm Jesse Eisinger. I'm a senior editor and reporter at ProPublica, and welcome to you all. I was reflecting on having attended the first of these conferences back in 2017, where I'd gotten to know Guy Rolnick a little bit, and I sort of thought, well, here's this kind of crazy Israeli journalist, and no one disdains journalists more than journalists, so I thought, we don't know anything, how could he know anything? And I sort of thought that maybe it was like a performance art piece to set it at the University of Chicago, and that was sort of more or less it. And then I come back now, 2023, and it seems to me like the conversation around antitrust has undergone a remarkable sea change. It has entered the public lexicon. It is a mainstream topic for journalists who are exploring this. We see regular stories about companies and their anti-competitive practices, something that really the business press, which is what I grew up in, I'm a kind of observer of the antitrust world, but not involved in it, but the business press has woken up to this. On the other hand, there's a joke in journalism that when you are writing out your prize letters, you'll be surprised to learn that journalists care about prizes, and if you haven't had any impact from your stories, you say, we changed the national conversation. And so, is antitrust doing anything? Are Cantor and Kahn and the Neo-Brandeisian school of scholars accomplishing anything? Have they? Our topic is going to be, are they measuring and analyzing the economy writ large properly and well enough to convince people? And I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation today. I will, since I'm at a university, I know I'm supposed to do this, I'm going to give everybody a trigger warning, which is that I told everybody on the panel to argue with each other, to pick fights and name names. So if they come across as rude, that's just because they're following instructions. Instructions from me. I worried that the first panel people wouldn't be awake, and we'd have to wake them up a little bit. And I've also asked them to make some opening presentations. And I'm going to ruthlessly enforce a 5 to 7 minute rule for these and cut them off mid-sentence, and just so that you guys can keep your eyes open. So John, I asked you to start. Why don't you give us your slides, your overview. We'll have short kind of overviews of people's work, and then I'll try to ask as many questions that occur to me, and then when I falter, I'll turn to all of you, and I hope you guys ask as many provocative questions as you can, and then we'll adjourn. So thank you. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Jesse. Is this working? Yes. And thanks to the organizers of this conference. It's a pleasure to be back here. I, too, was here in 2017, and that was a path-breaking set of sessions and conversations, and it's interesting to sort of follow up at this juncture. So what I want to do today is to not simply review some of the evidence, though that's really what the blurb introducing this panel suggests, but to see where some of this evidence takes us, to see what some further implications of the evidence we have on mergers and enforcement policy imply about the specific focus or locus of under-enforcement, with implications for further changes in merger enforcement practices. And specifically, I want to focus on what I call the enforcement gap. So the enforcement gap is the degree to which mergers with certain characteristics are systematically under-enforced by the agencies. There's widespread agreement that there's under-enforcement in general, But do we think that that occurs for 3-2 mergers or 5-4 mergers or 10-9 mergers? And in addition, I want to pair that information with some idea about the percent to which mergers with those very same characteristics prove to be anti-competitive. The gap between those two percentages is what I would call the enforcement gap. It's the shortfall of actual enforcement relative to the frequency with which mergers with those characteristics have proven to be anti-competitive. So I need to, and now I'll draw out some implications for, yes, the structural presumption. We're all being asked to be provocative, so I might as well start with that. Now, thank you for putting me on first, because everybody for 2 days now gets to take off on what I have to say.
Good.
I'm always grateful for that.
Good. Yes,
So the first bit of evidence comes from the Federal Trade Commission data itself. I've used this before. Some of you have seen this. The FTC, between the years 1996 and 2011, reported information on the total number of merger investigations that they conducted, more than 1,200. And by categories and characteristics, they also identified with what frequency they took any enforcement action. We can talk about the definition of that later on. But roughly speaking, it is the frequency with which they went after mergers with certain characteristics. And in using the data, whoops, not entirely what I wanted to have happen.
You can reclaim your time, Joe.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to keep using that as necessary. Thank you, Jesse. So one unsurprising factor and reassuring is that, of course, depending on the number of remaining significant competitors, which is defined in the data presentation by the FTC, an ever larger fraction of those high concentration mergers are subject to enforcement action. This we know. 78% overall, but certainly for 2-to-1 mergers, the answer is all but a few are subject to enforcement. But the interesting question is how this, two interesting questions. One, and this too I've talked about before, is that this has changed over time rather dramatically. And this is the evolution and narrowing of enforcement. So if you look at the sub-periods, which are the 4 columns to the right, the first column, 1996 to 2011, reproduces the data I just showed. But if you look at the subsequent columns, what you'll see is that while mergers resulting in 7-6 and 5-4 were enforced in the early years at 60%, 40%, 20%, by the 2008 to 2011 period, there were no longer any enforcement actions taken against mergers that resulted in 5 firms or 6 firms. And that ceased at an earlier date, 6 firms. 7 firms ceased even earlier. So this is the progressive narrowing of enforcement over time that I have commented on and criticized before. And it's the FTC's own data, and it's fully comprehensive. It's all the merger investigations. So this is, subject to qualifications of various sorts, but certainly it's not a sample. It's nothing other than my reworking of the data. Mind you, this is not the way the FTC reported it. And they no longer report this data at all. I don't want to take full credit for that, but so the implications are that enforcement has remained high for mergers in high concentration markets. For all those that have resulted in 4 or fewer, the numbers remain in the high 80s to 90%. But for mergers resulting in 5 or more competitors, the rate of enforcement has collapsed during this crucial period. And this is a chart that kind of shows the trend lines for the upper ones are mergers resulting in 1, 2, 3, or 4 mergers, and most of those firms, rather, most of those percentages have held up, but they have, as you see, progressively eroded and collapsed for mergers resulting in 5, 6, 7, or 8 mergers, significant competitors. So the next bit of data is to say, well, so what? Which of these mergers represent competitive concerns? And what do we know about that? For this, I've added and spliced the results from the meta-analysis that I've conducted on merger retrospectives. And we can talk about all the caveats about that at some later date, but this does represent what I do believe to be one of the more comprehensive, let us say, compilations of what we know about the outcomes of actual mergers. These are published studies using typically difference in difference analysis to identify the price effects. No, I don't think that price is the only issue about mergers, but it is the metric that presents itself most easily for a wide number of cases, so that is what I'm going to use. And so I had about 60 merger studies in the compilation, and I did a meta-analysis of these, and about more than 80% of all mergers resulted in price increases, and those price increases were non-trivial, more than 7% on average. The agencies investigated all of these mergers in the retrospectives and took action of any sort only in somewhat less than 40% of those cases. So that too is perhaps not, well, that was to some degree surprising, but what I really want to do is to disaggregate that data, again, by the number of remaining significant competitors to see what the percent of enforcement actions are against what we know to be the changing pattern of enforcement by the Federal Trade Commission. And, you know, again, I've got data using Herfindahl concentration and also data on the number of significant competitors. There's more data, which I'll show in a bit, using the Herfindahl. There's fewer observations, more like 20 or 22, was about the only ones we could recover. Myself and RAs went back to these periods.
That's your signal.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Went back to these very periods of time and looked at data on concentration numbers of significant competitors at the point where the merger was announced. And what it shows is that, you know, of the small number, and this is clearly an issue, that all of the mergers that resulted in 5 or fewer competitors in the merger retrospectives were anti-competitive. Okay, 80% of those at 6 competitors, somewhat lesser percentages, as one would expect thereafter. So I can look at I'm going to take, with your indulgence, I won't answer some questions afterwards. How's that?
Okay.
So, let me just get to
allow it.
No, anyway. So, thank you. So this is a map of the percent of anti-competitive mergers, this last slide I just showed, according to the number of remaining significant competitors. And this is, and the red line is the percent of action, the percent with which actions were taken for the very same numbers of remaining significant competitors. The gap between the two is the enforcement gap. High percentages continue to be addressed during this period of time by the FTC. And by the time you get to 8 or 9 competitors, there really are few, if any, anti-competitive consequences. But in the middle, where there are 4 or 5, maybe 3, certainly 4 or 5 or 6 competitors, this is the significant enforcement gap. This is where the shortfall occurs. So let me conclude, I guess, with 2 questions about which I wanted to say something. One is, what's going on here? Why is that the case? And there's several possible explanations. Resource issues, ideology, though this covers both Democratic and Republican administrations and lots of commissioners. But I think one of the important issues is that this is the range where taking actions based on coordinated effects is particularly difficult. The agency struggled to present cases that don't have damning documents or maverick firms addressing coordinated effects concerns. And it's in this region, it seems to me, that policy needs to deal with anti-competitive mergers differently. And my recommendation is the structural presumption. My recommendation has been, I recommended this before I worked at the FTC, and I continue to recommend it now. You can fill in the gap between those two any way you want. It seems to me that the structural presumption has good merit, and it also deals with the issue of, it reflects the Philadelphia National Bank language, and it also reflects an efficient way of dealing with mergers that defy proof on a case-by-case basis. Not, I might add, that a case-by-case basis has 100% accuracy rate either. So with that, and with your indulgence, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Simcha, it's your turn. All right. And you've promised to keep it under 7.
When you tell me to stop, I will stop.
Yeah, exactly. Or you get to finish your sentence.
And try to-
That was interesting, though, John. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. I actually wanted to spend some time at the beginning. Oh, I made these slides wide. Hopefully they'll show correctly. Just to delineate what I think of as 3 different types of research that you'll hear about today that Stigler conferences have covered in the past. Sometimes they're talked about together. This panel mixes them, but they're somewhat distinguished. The first topic that I would describe is illegal anti-competitive behavior on the part of firms. And a lot of this is covered by traditional antitrust enforcement law. This is set out in law. For example, the Sherman Act. It's been enforced since 1890. It's enforced by the Department of Justice and the FTC in the US. There's a split a little bit. It includes classical forms of anti-competitive behavior, such as price fixing, bid rigging, market allocation. You can go down the list. The second way in which the government enforces or oversees competition is through merger reviews. So John's previous talk was about merger reviews. Companies are seeking to merge with one another. The government is allowed to review it, not because they're alleging past harm, that they've already engaged in bad behavior, but they're afraid that by allowing the firms to merge, the larger firm would have more market power. So that's number two. Again, it's enforced by the DOJ and the FTC. Number three is also in this conference, past conferences by the Stigler Center and on this panel. They talk more broadly about market power by firms. This can be measured by profits, by markups, concentration, whether measured traditionally or accounting for the fact that there's overlapping ownership between the firms. It can be about big tech and big pharma. There have been panels at Stigler conferences that might not allege that they've broken existing antitrust laws, but there's a problem here for policy. And so there's an open question of whether and how this should be addressed by policy. Perhaps it is appropriate to hand this responsibility to the antitrust enforcers. Perhaps there's another way of dealing with it. It's an open question that could be asked and could be dealt with. Okay? Most, but not all of this research in the third bucket is not alleging that the firms have broken the law. There are some strands of research here that do, but not all of it does. And there can be some disagreement on how to interpret. Is Amazon's being big evidence that they've done something wrong or likely to do something wrong, or is it that they are better? There are multiple views here. Okay, so that's a distinction between the type of research you'll hear discussed at this panel and other panels today. Sorry. What I'll talk about briefly is my new work, and it's on the first category, just illegal anti-competitive behavior of the traditional sense. There's surprisingly little work on this. There's certainly work in what I would describe as case studies. They've looked at particular legislation. There's a lot of work, for example, or papers that I know, more than one on AT&T, including one of the ones I really like on being forced to license out the patent for transistors. All these are very nice. But there isn't a lot of systematic work, and part of this is there isn't standardized data. And so this project joined with a number of co-authors, and I promised Luigi this maybe 2 months ago. It really will be out in about 3 weeks. Ezra's having a second kid due in mid-May, and so it really will be out. It's a two-part project. We first collect and standardize the history of DOJ antitrust enforcement. So for this project, we started in 1971. If you have or will see a figure in one of Luigi's papers that goes from 1890, we provided the data for that. So we have it going back a while. The analysis, so we collect everything, but our analysis are going to focus on those cases that allege that there was bad behavior. So we're excluding everything having to do with mergers. We're really in bucket number one here. And I think we're going to be the first paper to really systematically, on a large scale, measure economic effects. We're going to look at the level of economic activity following antitrust enforcement. We're going to look at new business formation, and we're going to look at the distribution of income. And our results might not be very shocking, that bad behavior suppresses economic activity, and the antitrust enforcement actions correct that and improve economic activity. I'm not going to show you any statistics, but I'll give you a brief overview. This is just a histogram that counts the number of cases that we collect from 1971 to 2018. The micro data we can use for analysis started in 1977, so we haven't spent as much time cleaning up the earlier data, but we do have it. Oh, I'll make one more comment. We think that there is a lack of research in this area on systematic with large amounts of data, so we're going to make the data available later to people who want to do work in this area. All right. And again, what is it that they're choosing to enforce? Whether this is optimal or not, we're not going to discuss. I've broken this out into two groups. The paper will have a complete table. Here I've shown you, I've tried to make sure it fits in one slide. The numbers here can add up to more than 100% because one case can allege more than one type of bad practice. The most common allegations are bid rigging, price fixing, market allocation. Right? So they tend to appear in the horizontal violation category. These are also the least controversial. I don't think there are any economists in this room who would say it would be a bad idea for the DOJ to enforce these. The top three categories I put in green because those are the ones that go into our analysis. Merger violations, whether they're lawsuits brought to partially or completely block a merger or violations of pre-merger notification, these are really alleging potential future harm, and so we don't expect to find much in the data, we're not including it. This one, how much time do I have?
A little over a minute.
Terrific. The results will be on the next slide. If the results all look good. More economic activity, more new businesses enter, the distribution of income later favors labor. These results are permanent. You'll see it in the data 8 years out. It stays there. I want to explain one thing that we can and cannot do in the data. So there was a case brought in court against Google in 2020, and you might think this is a really important case because of Google's sheer size, its dominance. What makes this a potentially important case is also what makes it extremely difficult to study with concrete analysis. It's really hard to figure out how Google would have evolved going forward but for this case. What we're going to do instead is we're going to focus on non-tradable industries. So I'll give you a very kind of plain example. If the DOJ goes after supermarkets in Illinois. Less exciting, the big advantage here, we have a good way of measuring how the supermarket industry in Illinois would have evolved, but for the case. We can look at supermarkets in Massachusetts, in New York, in California, in Texas. It works very well in the data. The empirical evidence shows it's very convincing from my take. All right? I'll also say this isn't just a small amount of what the DOJ does. It isn't that the DOJ is focused only on the big cases and this is a side kind of project. This is about 2/3 of the cases. 2/3 of the cases are these types of industries that serve local populations. I suspect that the results would apply to the bigger dominant firms that are active globally or certainly nationally, but our evidence in its narrow sense is limited to the second category. I'll end here. If you have questions about the results, I'll take them in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm looking for the song that I play for my kids when they're trying to get ready in the morning to speed them up to get to go to school. You know, it goes. Da, 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 da. We also do Flight of the Bumblebees. So options for young parents. All right. Iona, are you ready?
Oh yeah, I can.
Okay, you're on.
All
Yes,
right.
late comer, but welcome. I'm glad that you made it.
I did.
Okay,
Success.
and as you can see, I'm being very ruthless about the time.
Yes.
Yes.
That's.
Well, you went over, but it's okay. I've built in a little expectation that you guys will take as much as you can get, and
So I'm gonna talk without slides about labor markets, some of the evidence from my research and antitrust enforcement, and right now I'm the principal economist at the DOJ ATR, the Antitrust Division. So, it's interesting with labor because I think as we've shown in a paper with Eric Posner, who's here, there has been until the past few years very little enforcement. And so one issue is, should we have any enforcement at all? Which, of course, it's a rhetorical question of sorts here. But I want to speak to the evidence that there is a lack of competition that's pervasive in labor markets across the US economy. And this lack of competition contributes to lower wages and probably worse jobs than we would otherwise have. And so, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the antitrust enforcement actions that we've been taking at the DOJ, as well as actually this is a growing area of enforcement internationally in many other jurisdictions. And it's been very interesting for me to observe the growth of this movement of enforcing the antitrust laws in the labor market across the world. In fact, I've partially based my remarks on a comment that I just filed in the Australian Parliament, where they're looking into issues of competition and competition policy, and I filed a comment about what's been happening around the world in this area of enforcement in the labor market. So the first thing to note is that there's evidence that employers can suppress wages due to limited competition in the labor market, and one of my own papers uses detailed data on job applications to show that ultimately the labor supply elasticity is quite low, meaning that workers aren't very sensitive to wages, and therefore the optimal markdown is going to be quite high, meaning that workers will be paid less than their marginal productivity. Specifically, we find that the implied markdown from our work implies that workers are about 20% more productive than the wages that they get paid. And secondly, we also find that many American labor markets are highly concentrated. We have a HHI in the labor market above 2,500. And this concentration is important because it's going to drive lower wages. So in our own work, we showed that increases in labor market concentration are associated with lower posted wages. So companies offer lower pay in markets that are more concentrated. Importantly, there are some difficulties with establishing that. We use an instrumental variable technique, and it's quite robust. But I think it's important to look at it also in a more quasi-experimental way. And there are important contributions to the literature by Prager and Schmidt that looked at hospitals, and more broadly for the whole US economy by Arnold, where they looked at mergers. So to the extent that we can see mergers as a quasi-experiment, we can look at the impact of mergers on wages as a function of concentration. And of course, this is also very relevant for enforcement, because mergers, in my everyday role, this is what we're looking at, to enforce against potentially, depending on the facts. And so what these papers find is that mergers that greatly increase labor market concentration lower wages. And so in a quasi-experimental setting, and one of the papers by Prager and Schmidt was published in the AR. So that's another fact to know. Now, there's a vast literature on this topic, since I started, and actually I'm excited to say that I'm working on several literature reviews on this topic, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of your work. So many of you are here in the room for this. And this is building up, and at the same time, there's been a buildup of antitrust enforcement. So that's the academic side, but enforcers around the world, have been working on this. So in the US, first off, we've been doing, the Antitrust Division has been suing companies in particular for collusion in labor markets, as well as around mergers. And so, it's kind of interesting. Let me first talk about mergers. It turns out that mergers of buyers as a potential issue, this has been mentioned in the merger guidelines since 1982, I found out. So this has a long history in the merger guidelines let me just make it clear. Buyers here, in the context of labor markets, these are employers, they are buyers of labor services, right? So that's an example. But since 1982, the merger guidelines said mergers of buyers can cause anti-competitive effects, right? So, and this has been then kept on and developed from there. So, at the DOJ, what we've had here is a very important case that we won in the fall. On Halloween, the decision came last fall, which was in a merger of two large publishers, where it was Random House and Simon & Schuster. So we decided to challenge this merger because we claimed that the mergers of these two very large publishers was going to reduce payments to authors who are trying to sell their books to these publishers. And the judge ultimately accepted our argument. The merger was blocked. The parties decided not to appeal. So that was the end of that merger. And it's the first time that a merger was blocked on account of monopsony effects that have that include labor service within this case. So that was very important, and we have a lot of interesting statements by the judge that's going to help us move forward. And then, the worldwide, there's also been growing enforcement, especially focused on, so Simcha was talking about these horizontal things. So price fixing in the labor market is wage fixing. And then market allocation in the labor market is going to be seen as no poaching agreements. So, if you and I agree not to hire each other's employees, it's the same essentially as saying, well, you keep your customers in Chicago, I keep my customers in Philadelphia. Let's agree, not to go after each other's customers. So it's market allocation. And these kinds of violations, horizontal violations, have been increasingly pursued both in the US and abroad. And in the US specifically, we've established, in a string of judicial decisions that they are in fact a per se violation of the antitrust laws. To have a no-poach agreement is in fact akin to market allocation and is a violation. Now, abroad, there are many antitrust authorities that have started taking action against collusion in labor markets, and it goes all the gamut from the UK, Spain, Romania, Brazil, you name it. This is a movement of enforcement that is now worldwide. And so not only that, some countries like Canada, and let me conclude with this, have realized that they weren't able to go after this because the antitrust laws did not encompass labor markets. And so in Canada, they just passed new legislation that forbids no poaching agreements. They had to say it because it wasn't obvious from their antitrust laws, but I think that that's a very interesting development to know about, as far as this labor market enforcement worldwide. So that's what I had to say. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you. I like to think of that as the we should have thrown Steve Jobs in prison initiative. If everybody remembers, he got away with all that long before these revelations. So it's really encouraging work. Okay, Martin, can you give us an update on concentration and cross ownership, and then Chad's going to come in and dissent and blow criticize everybody here. I'm hoping. All right, Martin, go ahead.
So thanks very much for having me. I want to start by showing you a few facts about who owns US public firms, and then explain how it relates to the consumer welfare discussion, the theme of the conference. So the first thing I'm showing here is the average share across S&P 500 single class firms from 2004 to 2020 by the so-called big three asset managers. And you can see they held somewhere between 2 and 3% or 2 and 4% back then, but now Vanguard on average holds more than 10% of the average S&P 500 firm. And BlackRock, that's this jagged line here, since buying BGI also has become large, although it grows a bit less fast. And I want to emphasize, this is a percentage of the outstanding shares, not the shares that get voted, which is a lot less. No? So jointly, they control 23% of the stock, so it's kind of hard to see how they wouldn't be influential, really, in any voting model. However, the increase in common ownership of competitors, right, so these firms own lots of competitors, is not just due to indexing, as many or some people have claimed, and I think that's incorrect. So for one, some active investors are also buying competitor stakes. In the past, I often used Berkshire Hathaway as an example, but here I'll give you a different one. Cascade Investments is Bill Gates' family office. Those are 3 waste management companies in America. And you can see, actually, stakes are kind of large, right? So you buy a third of one firm, and together with the Gates Foundation, hold a bit more than 8% in the direct competitor. And also, that is not an exception. Activist hedge funds do it as well. Pershing Square buys large stakes in Burger King, Chipotle's, and Domino's Pizza, and so forth. All right, so those are anecdotes, but what I want to convince you of is that this is a systemic phenomenon. Okay, so what I'll show you now is a regression of our favorite measure of common ownership that's now used in the literature on various types of investors' holdings. And as you might suspect, the CEO and board members, they tend to hold mostly shares in their target firm, so that reduces common ownership of competitors. But the surprising part that I just claimed is that activist holdings actually increase it, okay? Of course, indexing, as you might suspect, increases it as well. But the interesting part is that over and above indexing, the holdings by the big three also increase measures of common ownership. And this is by contrast to a paper in the literature that claims that once you control for indexing, really the big three don't have any additional effect on common ownership. And that finding is just wrong, because for one, they misparse the 13F filings from the SEC. And second, look, in order to see that Bill Gates, the family office, holds these large stakes, you cannot only look at 13F filings, which is what the literature typically uses, you have to scrape all the others as well. And that's something we do in that paper that I'm flashing down there. Okay, so common ownership is not just driven by indexing, but also by activists. And I think that's important when you think about what the low-hanging fruit are in enforcement. Okay? Why would it be that the big three holdings could have a positive effect over and above indexing? Because remind yourself, BlackRock is not an index fund. BlackRock is a family of funds that centralize all the voting decisions across these different funds in one central office. So it's just centralization of corporate control that drives common ownership. Well, and yet, in the US, competition authorities mostly ignore this. No? So there's been a conference on it, but I mean, in actual enforcement practice, it's mostly enforced. In some jurisdictions, actually, the five of us could hold 20% of all firms, and the authorities wouldn't even know about it. So Thomas Wollman and John Barriers have just written about this for the US, that private equity gets afforded a special treatment in terms of HSR notifications. And the reason I'm telling you all that is because it has something to do with the discussion about the consumer welfare standard. So there's three reasons for that. One is because there's not just a question of whether conceptually the consumer welfare standard is the right thing to do, but also how it is applied. And completely ignoring who owns the firm is one thing, but another is that even if one takes into account ownership, but uses the typical modern I/O methods to estimate markups, one will miss this phenomenon, and I want to explain why that is. And the reason is that these models tend to assume that the marginal costs are fixed, then estimate the margins on top of that. But what if the problem is that the costs increase as a result of common ownership? And the reason I believe that is because of a paper I have with Florian, who that's forthcoming in the JPE, that explains why. Okay, so here's how the paper goes. So imagine there's a transaction of shares. For example, because a competitor gets added to the S&P 500 index, and therefore all the existing index funds, so the owners of the incumbent firms, have to buy the shares in their competitor. That increases common ownership. No? Now, that is going to reduce investors' incentives to monitor these firms. Why is that? Well, look, because if you monitor one firm and that reduces that firm's costs, well, that's bad news for that firm's competitor, right? So if you own both the firm and the competitor, you have reduced incentives to spend resources monitoring that firm, all right? So as a result, when common ownership goes up, monitoring goes down, or you just give the managers less performance-sensitive incentives, and as a result, so our Milgram-Holmström type models make us believe the firm's costs will go up. But if all the firm's costs are higher, well, then the prices are going to be higher, okay? So my point is the following. If that's the right story, that explains these findings in the common ownership literature of common ownership causing higher prices. It's not because margins are higher. It's because the costs are higher. It's because the firms are inefficiently run, not well monitored. It's a productive inefficiency. And to show you some facts, so this is from that paper with Florian, Miguel, and Mireia. Here is when the firm gets added to the index. The vertical axis is pay performance sensitivities of the top management, and bink, they go down, okay? So it's just reduced incentives as a result of common ownership. So again, if you use a model that estimates margins, you will miss that. So we might see a huge structural transformation in the economy of firms' cost base is increasing, productivity going down, but our normally used methods wouldn't detect it, okay? So in that case, the problem is not with the standard, but it is with the tools we use to estimate the loss of welfare, or as Tim Wu writes in his pro-market contribution, we apply the consumer welfare standard to an idealized world. That's not the world we live in.
That's your note. Yeah.
The note is heard. Okay. The second point I want to make is that people like Tommaso get a lot of heat for proposing structural presumptions, okay? But what I want to point out is we already make structural presumptions. And the structural presumption is that a firm, two firms, whose shareholder base 100% overlaps, it has literally the same shareholders. Those two firms compete just as much as if they had perfectly separate shareholder bases. That's what we assume, right? Unless we take ownership into account. And, you know, needless to say, I think that presumption might have to be rethought one way or the other. Now, in order to do that, you need data to implement, which brings me to the last and very quick and brief point, which is I sometimes think that the consumer welfare standard is probably not the biggest problem and the biggest elephant in the room that prevents enforcement, but there might be political will that is lacking as well, right? So why is it that competition authorities still 10 years after this agenda saw center stage are still not properly collecting correct and comprehensive ownership data? We think that's kind of weird. I mean, that's why we provided that public good. But that just makes me think that perhaps political will is an important element as well. And when I read Anat's contributions on pro-market, she tells us that we have to not ignore political economy to make any sort of impact, okay? So all in sum, that makes me think we might be missing something big by how we apply the consumer welfare standard, namely by ignoring ownership, by using the wrong data to measure it if we do, and by using models that assume costs to be fixed, although it might be that it's the cost basis, the productivity, that is really the elephant in the room. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Very interesting. Okay. Now, Chad, you have a big task in front of you. Knock all of these down in less than 7 minutes.
Easy.
Yeah.
No. I have two roles on the panel. One, as Jesse just said, is to be a skeptic, and I can do that. I'm not reflexively skeptical about everything that's been said, and I know this work quite well. I've read a lot of it very closely and find a lot of it quite believable. But I do have some skeptical notes to offer about perhaps implications of what people have found. And the other role is the theme of the session, Antitrust Affects the U.S. Economy, is the macroeconomics of antitrust. Now, I am mostly a microeconomist, but I have a foot in macroeconomics, or if you ask macroeconomists, maybe I have a toe in macroeconomics, but I have some part of my body in macroeconomics. So I'd like to really highlight that perspective as well. Okay, so let me start with the macro. There have been, over the past, let's say, 10 to 20 years, some pretty stark trends in the macroeconomy, like increasing average profit rates, decreasing labor share of income, decreasing dynamism measured in a number of different ways, entry and exit rate of companies, labor flow rate, gross labor flow rates relative to net labor flow rates, sort of a metric of the amount of churn that's going on in the economy. All of those and others have been trending down. People have looked at the collection of those trends and said, well, one explanation for the collection of those things is increasing market power. Okay? Folks have estimated in a number of different ways trends and metrics of market power. One being, I think, a very direct metric, which is the markup. So the DeLuca, Eckert, Unger, and the other work that's come along measuring average markup levels in the economy, finding that they've been trending up for 20, 30 years as well. And so that sort of, I think, brings into the conversation the notion that the decline in antitrust enforcement, which John was highlighting, might be causing this increase in average market power as measured, and then therefore having these macroeconomic effects that I was mentioning. All right. So I think that is a perfectly fair inference. I think that the quality of the evidence altogether is not dispositive yet. There are a lot of methodological things we don't need to talk about that are raised about these measures of markups and the increase. My view on that is basically the argument is markups have gone up this much, but if you adjust, no, really they've gone up this much, and if you really make this change, then maybe they haven't gone up at all. But that range is always positive. No one's out there convincingly arguing, no, actually markups have gone down over the last 20 years. So I am willing to say a good Bayesian is going to think maybe average market power has increased over the past couple decades. Okay? So that's fine. I'm reluctant, however, to then say, ergo, all of these macroeconomic trends that we wouldn't think are good are therefore the result of the increase in market power. There are other explanations that technologies have changed in ways that also explain those trends. I don't think that story has been knocked down. I think it's a little tricky because actually some of those technological changes, even if they're exogenous, will increase markups in equilibrium. You have to, if fixed costs go up, you got to pay the fixed costs. So you have to have markups to pay fixed costs. Now that it could be the increase in markups in that story is just because technology changed for perhaps exogenous reasons to any policy choices, but markups had to go up in equilibrium. I don't think that the response to that is to say we've totally blown it because we haven't enforced antitrust enough. That's just a separate conversation in that world. Okay, so that I think is kind of grants credence to what people have found, but is a little skeptical or at least cautious about how much we want to say we can fix all this with antitrust. Another thing I'd like to raise skepticism about is the use of concentration as a metric of the amount of competition, in particular as inversely measured to the amount of competition. This is an old story that most of you in the room I know have heard, but I'd still like to emphasize it. A market working exactly as we would like it to, that is rewarding quality adjusted, the highest quality adjusted, the firms producing products with the lowest quality adjusted price. That kind of market is going to concentrate. Concentration will go up, but that's exactly what we want to happen. Okay? And this is not just a theoretical matter. There is plenty of work, especially in trade. Go read the trade literature about reductions in trade costs, ergo increases in the competitiveness of a market, concentrating the market as outputs reallocated to more efficient firms. Okay, so I don't think this is just a theoretical concern. I am especially concerned about thinking about concentration across industries as reflecting anything. Does an HHI of 1,100 in industry X compared to 1,400 in industry Y tell us that industry Y must be less competitive than X? I think we basically learn nothing from that comparison, okay? And even within industries, due to that force I was just talking about, it's not clear at all that concentration is inversely related to competition. Mergers are a little tougher because what mergers are really doing is taking out one entity that is not internalizing the business dealing effects its decisions have on another, and that's what creates competition effectively. And so if you take out that entity, you can raise prices, and the amount the prices might go up can be correlated with the market share, the overlapping market share of the two firms. So maybe concentration is a little better, a little more useful there. But the cross-sectional use of concentration, and especially outside of mergers, makes me skeptical. There's my skeptical role. Thanks. Last thing I'd like to mention. Most of my work in the macro world is about productivity. And so if I ask the big question, how do I think antitrust affects productivity? Well, first let me make the point. In the long run, productivity is everything. Productivity growth is the thing that affects our standards of living. Okay, so the question is, how much does antitrust affect productivity? I don't know. I'm not so sure it's large. Okay? I think it might have, I think competition might have very sector-specific effects in terms of productivity. If I think about the evolution of US retail, maybe world retail, over the past 3 decades or so, about how new business models have come in and made the sector much more efficient. Okay, that's what I view as good competition. Competition that, by the way, concentrated that market. Okay? That was helped, that innovation was helped by competitiveness. Was it helped by antitrust? That I'm not so sure. Okay? And I think a lot of the really broad productivity effects come from general purpose technologies. And here, I'm not so sure antitrust has much effect on the diffusion and adoption of general-purpose technologies? Did it affect how quickly we electrified the economy in the early 20th century, how quickly computers were adopted, or looking forward, AI, which I think is the next general-purpose technology? Do we think we're going to dial up and down how quickly AI diffuses with antitrust policy? I am skeptical about that as well. So I'm not so sure beyond sector-specific effects whether antitrust policy in specific is going to really turn the dial on long-run outcomes. All right, thank you.
Okay, great. Excellent. So I think that sets us up very nicely for a conversation now. First, I kind of want to separate this conversation into two parts. One, the strength of the evidence that there's a market power problem in at least in the American economy, and then the question of whether that is due to the lack of antitrust enforcement, and then finally, let's talk about sort of priorities. I mean, when I was prefacing my remarks, I had forgotten to make the point that the change in the attitude from 2017 to today strikes me as a victory for the reality-based world, that reality seems to have a pro-antitrust enforcement bias, and that the evidence seems to be stacking up. That is, that we have a serious issue in the American economy, at least, if not globally. So I guess I want to put Chad's sort of initial proposition. I think that it was kind of remarkable that you agree, Chad, that there is an issue, and then it's a question of degree. Does anybody on the panel, does everybody on the panel agree that the evidence is definitive that there is a market power problem in the American economy?
Does that make something a problem?
What?
What would make something a problem?
Okay, so pick up on that. Is it is the evidence is that there are these firms that have excess profits? They have margins. They have the margins are too high. Is it a problem or is it not? Is it a problem for dynamism in the economy? Is it a problem for wages?
So my reading of the literature is that there is good evidence that measures of market power have gone up. And I'll keep out the concentration, but rates of profit, rates of turnover among large firms, markups, they all seem to have gone up. And I think that's pretty clear in the data and hard to kind of construct a measure that doesn't show it. Even the ones, I can talk to Chet afterwards, even the ones that he's quoting that says maybe zero, I think the author presents it as maybe zero, but if translated correctly, it's maybe a 20% increase.
Still consistent with my
So,
Bayesian posterior.
Agreed. I think there are repercussions to this. How convincing is the evidence? I think mild, moderate, somewhat. I'm a believer because I'm part of the literature. I think there's certainly repercussions. I think we would all want to live in a world where we had all of the good technology, all of the good firms producing everything that we like to consume, and simultaneously have them compete more with one another. Is that feasible? I don't know.
Well, isn't the argument that the competition gets the better products, and that when we see a lack of competition, now we see Google's product eroding, Amazon's product eroding?
So I do think so. This will relate to the second question of whether this is due to competition authorities dropping the balls. And there's reason to point to the 1980s as kind of the point of reflection, both in attitudes related to competition authorities and to all of these trends. And that's a plausible hypothesis. And the alternative is that there are other technological forces in globalization that also start and reflect in the 1980s. These might also lead to dominant firms. And so it's not clear if you can have dominant firms that provide good services and competition. I would hope so.
Yeah,
So I don't know.
I think that's one of the potent critiques here of this idea is that, and we'll get to antitrust enforcement in a second, but that this is the natural outgrowth of superstar firms, and we're seeing winner-take-all dynamics in lots of markets. We see a strange and I'm very pro this strange dynamic in a winner-take-all dynamic in nonprofit journalism, where people have come to ProPublica, thank God, and donate their money, and we attract more money attracts more money. Doesn't have to do with anything to do with our profit margins. So is this a super? You have a comment, Mark?
Yeah. So. I don't have much to say about the strength of the evidence economy-wide, but I want to question, for the purpose of provocation, as per the instructions, the lens through which we look at that, right? Increasing markups could be a much smaller problem than increasing costs, no? With increasing markups, at least somebody gets the welfare, namely the shareholders. And I go back to what I said in the talk. Look, our lens is completely focused on markups, so I don't know why markups are a problem, necessarily, as opposed to the increasing costs. So, and as an example, another example of the lens through which we look at this, I'll take issue, again, as per the instructions, with one thing Chet said. So he says, when you have a merger, you take out one entity that does not internalize the business dealing decisions on the others. And you know where this is going? Well, that's an assumption. I mean, that assumes the firms don't act in their shareholders' interest, because if they did, and the shareholders are diversified, they would already internalize the business dealing decisions. And again, the provocative thought, I don't necessarily believe that, but the provocative thought is, in that case, we might be completely over-focusing on M&A because we ignore the ownership. We ignore that they were already commonly owned. We deprive these firms from the opportunity to realize all these cost efficiencies that we have a hard time finding in the data. But at least, potentially they would be there in a merger, but you might not be able to get them just by having them owned by the same investors. Again, I don't necessarily believe that, but I just want to point out that we look at this problem from a kind of homogeneous lens and think of markups as bad. And the superstar firms, that's when I raised my hands, because I can only keep three things in my head at the same time. Right, so what are the superstar firms in the data? Right, so it's like Amazon, right, or Walmart and Google.
Depends who you ask.
Who's that?
Depends who you ask.
Yeah, okay. So
It was Facebook until 9 months ago.
Okay, Facebook, all right, until 9 months ago. Okay, look, what do they have all in common? They have in common that the largest shareholder does not hold the competition, right? You have Jeff Bezos, or you have the Britain, whoever they're called at Google, the Waltons at Walmart, right? So the superstar firms tend to be those that apparently work really hard to reduce costs and be competitive. So again, for provocation, and I guess in line with why do we worry that markups are high in some firms? Maybe we should worry about those firms where the markups are not high and how we get them more efficient.
Oh, can I ask you? Go ahead.
I just want to jump in about the common ownership and say that we are actually vigorously enforcing not exactly that, but interlocking directorates, which is related. When somebody sits on the boards of two companies that compete, the Clayton Act Section 8, and you can look at our press release from March, we are going after these people systematically. We are combing data and going after them for them to step down. So I think that goes in that direction. I think it does hopefully have a deterrent effect going forward, that people will know that we're watching. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I just wanted to point out is that I hear some sort of skepticism, maybe antitrust isn't going to do it and so on. And, who knows, right? Different effects could be different in different contexts. And that's why actually I think it's very interesting that you looked at this, the effects of these enforcement actions. I think it's very important for us enforcers and more generally for policymakers to know what's happening and what are some of the effects of what we're doing, and what tools do we have that might be more effective at accomplishing certain effects. Then it's up to the political to decide what effects they want to obtain. But I think researchers have a lot to say, and we should work harder on saying like, oh, what are some of the economics here, and which specific tool is likely to have what kind of effects and how big, and therefore that kind of expands our knowledge base in order to do, evidence-based policy.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Let me add a small point here, and that is that we're focusing a lot in this, not in the present discussion, on the business stealing notion, and that is a benchmark of competition, which it surely is. But competition is moderated in other ways that don't really fit, I think, comfortably into that paradigm. I mean, that paradigm is kind of the cartel model, where there's an incentive for firms to break out themselves, and if they internalize this, then this is to their private advantage. But, let me return to my theme about coordinated effects. Coordinated effects stories do not necessarily follow that very easily. And my point in my presentation was to note the fact that coordinated effects cases are difficult to bring because the theory is fuzzy and doesn't produce bright line standards or metrics like unilateral effects proceedings do. And so, there are benefits to joint activity that, have to overcome business stealing incentives, but really it's focusing too narrowly, I think, on the diversion or unilateral effects issues between the firms. In addition, I would say that, firms moderate competition in a lot of other ways that don't involve pure overcoming of business stealing or coordinated effects impediments. Companies are quite adept at identifying ways of moderating competition, and they raise difficult, legal threshold standards as well as difficult economics. But all of them are part and parcel, it seems to me, of merger analysis. And so we need to be careful, in my view, not to narrow our lens to thinking solely about business stealing and the paradigm that elevates that as a particular focus.
So let me pick up on that point, John, and put this to everybody, but you can pick it up first if you want, John, which is to say that whether you think the lack of antitrust enforcement caused the problems in the economy, the degree to which it caused it or contributed to the problems, the presumption then would be that the return of antitrust enforcement would help alleviate these problems. And one question is that true? Can antitrust enforcement do that? And then, taking off from your point of view that there are lots of fuzzy ways of doing anti-competitive behavior, if the blunt tool of antitrust enforcement can't address those easily, then is it good enough? And I open that up to everybody.
So you offered me the chance to speak first, so I'll never turn something like that down. But I don't have any way of measuring the degree to which the narrowing and relaxation of antitrust enforcement has contributed relative to other factors. I think that's a difficult assessment, and I don't know exactly how I would do that. What is clear to me, though, is that there are sectors of the economy, industries, and certainly innumerable examples in the data where as I said, the enforcement gap focuses attention. It identifies the locus of under-enforcement. And in those cases, we do see price increases above and beyond that which otherwise would occur. And I would say that that's pretty convincing as a line of causation for the retrenchment of antitrust and the ability of firms to successfully get mergers cleared and then, as a result, to raise price afterwards. Now, I would be the first to say that more data is necessary, that there are qualifications here. When I was at the FTC, I re-examined the merger retrospectives program that ostensibly exists there, but it's which Joe Simons started when he was chair, and many others, including Bill Kovacic and others, have recommended for generations, seemingly, without the FTC, in fact, launching a full-scale merger retrospectives program. But I do believe that there's much to be gained from that, because those are the cases that the agencies, in fact, have examined carefully, cleared in many cases, And they have the unique ability to go back and take a further look at the outcomes of these. And so, I think much more along these lines is certainly necessary. But I think the evidence creates a very strong hypothesis to be examined here. And the line of causation using merger retrospectives is pretty straightforward, much more so, I think, than efforts to follow the the lines of causation in other ways.
I want to pick up on the point of retrospectives in a second, but you, Iona, made a great point to me in our conversation, which is that the lack of labor side enforcement suggests that might have the biggest upside.
Right.
Can you expand on that, and you agree with that?
So simply the point is, as economists, we often see the biggest effect right in the beginning, and then there's decreasing returns, the usual thing. So I guess my point is simply that because we haven't done much antitrust enforcement in the labor market, and because the labor market, well, it has some special aspects, but more or less you could, in a first approximation, it's a market like any other, but where there was no enforcement. In that sense, there is a lot of potential upsides to doing more, starting from zero, right? And we've started, and we're going there, and therefore there's reasons to believe this is a theoretical statement, okay? When we, and then we're talking about evidence, one would have to look. But in theory, there's good reasons to expect that, you can have large impacts from this kind of enforcement when you start from doing almost nothing in that market.
Where would you allocate the resources for antitrust enforcement? Do you agree that it should be on the mergers of 6 to 5? Should it be in labor? I think of sort of price fixing and bid rigging as the just to plug my own book, the chicken shit enforcement of the antitrust world. Like
wage fixing is price fixing. Just noting, wage fixing is price fixing.
Right, but that's at least innovative and touches on real human beings. And I wonder if there are other ways to better priorities. What do you think, Simcha?
I'll make a small comment on priorities, and then I want to answer the question you started with. So one thing I noticed in the data, there are a little over 3,000 cases. We had undergraduate RAs read them twice, enter, reconcile. I've read a few hundred on my own. One thing that stands out is if you cheat the government on a contract, good chance that the DOJ is coming after you. Is it a big contract, small contract? The DOJ will come. Cheating means bid rigging here. Bid rigging cases with the government, they come after you. And that someone should. Is that the priority? I'm not sure. We'll chat afterwards. You have, you don't have a mic.
We'll give you lots of time to throw as many bombs as you can.
Great.
Hold off on them.
I think in the big picture, look, I've been working on the antitrust project now for more than 2 years. I've worked on M&A and tried to look at their aggregate implications. I think the micro evidence is pretty convincing, and I would be happy to recommend more money to the DOJ Antitrust Enforcement Agency. I think it would do good. Will that get us macro effects? I would be delighted if it did. Am I convinced it will? No. So, but there isn't much harm in trying. If I think it'll do good, ramp up some money and see what happens.
Martin, what about interlocking directorates? Is that enough? I mean, that's not bringing a case against Vanguard. It's not bringing a case against BlackRock.
So I think the low-hanging fruit approach is a good one. So a little bit of the meta message I wanted to show here is like we don't have to debate about the fundamental inconsistency between diversification and competition and then get stuck for 15 years and then meanwhile let activist investors monopolize industries, right? So I'm all for enforcing the low-hanging fruit, right? And in particular, you're focusing on private equity, which I think is clearly, again, low-hanging fruit. You don't have to debate about whether they influence firms and what the mechanism is and what not. So I'm all happy with enforcement actions that don't go after my index fund. I like my index fund.
You talked about political economy, and I think your research has come under a lot of pressure. BlackRock, in particular, has attacked you, pushed back. How difficult is it to do this kind of research in that environment with huge forces being, and with endless resources being brought to bear against this kind of research?
Okay, so the problem is last night I had one beer too many and sat next to Jesse at dinner. I should have had some champagne for breakfast as well in order to answer that question. No, but I want to actually be a little bit careful because I have a student of mine in the room and I don't want to scare her off. And no, but frankly, I actually prefer to have a conversation about substance rather than about people's motivations. But then again, so that's why I've never talked about this, ever really, publicly. But then I can't look Anat in the eye and say we have to take political economy seriously and then like sit on my tongue and not talk about this. So yeah, so it's been pretty difficult. So what it started with is BlackRock started a bit of a PR campaign that just misrepresented what we did, which influenced quite a bit also the academic reception of the work. You know, like, I don't believe that Vanguard asks firms to collude. It's like, we never said that. This is just not even what the research says. But so this PR campaign was quite effective. Then they declared this public policy discussion to be a business risk, right? So BlackRock declared to their investors that this could have an adverse effect on their business if anybody did anything about it, right? Sponsored studies, and attempted to prevent the publication from the paper, called the journal, told them that they should get to scrutinize the data before that gets published and delayed that. The mutual fund lobby organization hired one very senior finance professor as a director, who then got very busy and sat on one of my other papers for 2 years before it got published. So that was pretty tough as a pre-tenure guy. Or then I got emails from my colleagues that said, they stopped me at a conference, offered a lot of money to me. I just want to let you know, I didn't take the money, but they're in the market to do harm to you, quote end. And when you're like a young assistant professor with a young family, that gets you just kind of scared and intimidated, frankly. And that happened many, many more times. I can't count the number of times that people have told me that they were offered money on that. And of course, I was only told by those that declined the money. So there were deans of business schools that were paid visits by BlackRock directors, or so I'm told. I wasn't in the room. And offered money to take apart my research and the salary negotiations, and were a little interesting the day after. You know, so these involved the question of whether I would publicly speak up against Eric, Glenn, and Fiona's policy proposal if I got tenure at that institution, which I thought, that is, I don't think how this is supposed to work. So we got real scared, huh? So that made it pretty difficult for a while. But so to unscare the students again, so it's much more quiet now, it's fine. I went through a phase of my life in which I had to do a lot of yoga in order to get my system back in check. No, but seriously, I think they worked under the assumption that if they killed the airlines paper, then the literature would die. And that didn't work, right? So the problem is not going away. The literature is now hundreds of papers, so I think they at some point realized that they can't kill it and that they have to address the problem.
I think it's a really remarkable story, and I'm glad that you talked about it. Your former boss, John, also has come in for a little criticism. I think Lina Khan may be the biggest lightning rod in the Biden administration, of the appointees. Kind of perennial person being attacked. You spent a year at the FTC advising. What was your experience like, and how was that going, and how good a job is she doing?
Well, just between you and me,
It's the old Connie Chung line. We're just talking like friends. Yeah.
well, how to answer that question? So it was an incredibly stimulating and gratifying and exhausting experience, as almost anyone who has served in a similar capacity will attest. Lena had asked me to come on and work on merger guidelines, and I ended up working on remedies issues and many other matters that came to her, and as a result across my desk as well. So it was a deep insight into the way the agency worked. I had worked at the FTC a long time ago earlier, not in a similar capacity, but so I knew the agency, knew the folks there, and it was quite insightful still to see how it did operate. Now, Lena Khan has brought an agenda, a perspective, initiatives, energy to the institution. She's, I think much to her credit, tried to fix things about the institution as well as to change policy. Turning a ship around is a hard job, and it takes some time. And I think to her credit, she has persisted in all of that. The comparison with DOJ is not quite apt. You know, the Justice Department Antitrust Division is structured differently. The issues that affect the way the FTC works include the fact that it's a commission. So there's no singular head that can say, I want this to happen, and it does. Most policy matters have to pass before all the other commissioners. Many go to a vote, and we're all aware of what that elicits from dissenting commissioners. But I am a firm believer in Lena Khan's agenda, and it actually was very, very gratifying to be part of that experience on her behalf. I'm not sure what she thinks, but you can ask her that.
And you planted this question deftly earlier, so I will ask it, which is, what's going on with those merger guidelines? Why they seem delayed? Is that an internal problem? Are the DOJ and FTC fighting with each other? This seems like one of the most crucial tasks before the agencies, if they really want to reset antitrust enforcement in this country, and they haven't accomplished this. What's happened?
So I've never been asked that before. The reason I mentioned this to Jesse earlier is that whenever I appear, whenever I talk, everybody asks that question. I can try to wash my hands of that by saying, well, I left there 4 months ago, and so I don't know what's happened since. But it is true, this is no secret, that when I did come to Lena Khan's to be her economic advisor, it was specifically with the plan that there be a draft version of the guidelines within a year or so, which is what I had committed to spending there, and I ended up spending about 15 months. And that time has expired, and there still are no guidelines. So it's a combination of things, some of which I know and can't tell you, and others things I don't know and therefore certainly can't tell you. But it is a matter of, I think, concern and frustration to everyone that we haven't seen them. And probably one of the unspoken, disadvantages of delay is that part of the plan was to get out a set of guidelines that at least fix the things that many of us thought were needed fixing or needed addressing in the 2010 guidelines, and to do so in a timeline that would allow staff at the agencies to actually use the new guidelines to address matters that the 2010 guidelines were silent about, like labor market issues or the digital tech sector or some other things. And also to revise other matters that were spoken about in the 2010 guidelines, but perhaps needed revision. Staff, of course, hasn't had new guidelines, not even in draft form, much less approved, to be able to use. And I think that is one of the unfortunate consequences of the delays. Have I evaded your question successfully?
You did magnificently. Yeah,
I've had a lot of
couldn't tell
practice
what
at
that
this.
meant. I'll have to press you on it. But Chad, what do you think about these this discussion of enforcement? Do you think are you skeptical that enforcement can bring about the changes that you identified, or changes to the issues that you identified? And what specifically do you think there should be and shouldn't be in enforcement, and how they've been approaching?
So, just as a general statement, I think antitrust law is a good law. We should enforce it. It'll have good effects on the margin. The question is, and I don't think there was a lot of disagreement, whether it's going to have big macroeconomic effects. Is it going to have percentage point per year effects on growth rates? No way. Is it going to have 10th percentage points effects on growth rates? I'm not sure about that. Maybe. I'll take it. I'll take another 0.1% for 30 years. That'll add up to something. But it's not going to be revolutionary, and it's not the primary thing holding us back. So, yes, let's enforce antitrust law. I think it improves welfare on average. I think there's a case that
So there's
it's
no
being
harm. It's not harmful.
well, no, you can bring bad cases. Do I think the expected value of the next case broad is negative? No, but I think you still need to be careful about it. We could talk about the sort of new
Chicago economist calls for more enforcement. I like it.
I'm fine. Yeah. One thing that's come up, and I'm an empiricist. I try not to be ideological. I try to base what I believe and what I recommend based on my read of the quality adjusted empirical evidence. I think for a long time antitrust, both sides, has been not very empirical. I think we all agree we want more empiricism so we can make better decisions. That is one concern I have about the new paradigm at the FTC, but I can leave that for another day.
No, expand. Go ahead.
All right. I actually think that case, Lena Khan, not personally, but as an exemplar, is an example. I'm not going to say anything about what the FTC is doing. I think it's an example of bad incentives in legal scholarship, and here's where I am going to make people in the room angry. I think there's a lot of incentive to say provocative things without a lot of evidence, and if you're telling the right parties things they want to hear, it has a lot of influence. That's, I think, was a problem with the old literature in economics. I know a lot of people who, made quite a name for themselves by telling people things that they wanted to hear without a lot of evidence. I've liked during my career that economics, to my view, has moved more towards you have to back up what you're bringing. And I think that's good for scholarship, but I'm not so sure that ethos is quite as strong, at least in the I don't know all legal scholarship, but the stuff that overlaps with antitrust, that is a bit of a concern to me. And that's making no statement on what the FTC is doing or should do. I just generally think the sea change in the view towards that, and I could say provocative things without evidence, that's not hard. The hard thing is actually, doing the work. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Sorry. That's more than I wanted to say about it. You're a good moderator.
Provocative things without evidence is a journalist's job. So let's, does anybody want to pick up or take issue with that? Is that a fair critique, Iona? Do you?
I think I'd better not comment.
All right. Well, then I'm going to ask you something. Cantor has had, the DOJ has had some, you pointed to a big win. They've had some significant losses, a string of significant losses. I'm kind of pro-loss myself. I think it's important to bring cases, and sometimes a loss can be salutary, but you can't have too many of them. So how damaging have those losses been to the cause of anti-enforcement, or to cause of antitrust enforcement, and what do you think about them so far in the record?
Well, I mean, as a general matter, just I think piggybacking on Chad's point about expected, outcome. It's always expected. We take an action that we think is legitimate, and sometimes it doesn't pan out, in the courts, and that's just the name of the game. And you could argue that if it's like my husband loves to say that, if you go to the airport, you're so cautious, you never miss a plane. You might be wasting time, going there too much in advance. And so, you might make one might make a similar argument here that, if you're so overly cautious that you never lose a beat, maybe you're not developing, the case law. So I think, that's one way that one might think about it.
So, Simcha, do you think that the record so far from the Biden administration is impressive? Do you think they've got the right priorities? You haven't been directly involved.
I ended my data collection in 2018. I'll make that was based on when we started the project. We needed cases to have finished their full legal kind of process, and so I'll leave. One thing I will point out in the data is if I showed you just the counts of cases, and I didn't tell you the exact years, but I told you the start date and end date, and I said pick out the Republican versus Democratic administrations from Reagan onwards, not beforehand. Would you successfully pick out Republican versus Democrat? Probably not.
Probably not.
Probably not.
There
You
was
wouldn't get the
no
transition.
difference between
There's a trend downwards, and there are movements
Bush
around the trend.
administrations and Clinton or Obama.
I don't think if I gave you the same figure I put up earlier, just count and ask you to pick out Democratic versus Republican administrations, you would do an excellent job.
So isn't that a credible indictment of the Democratic administrations?
Could I add something to that? I think
Yes.
I've observed a substantial difference within the same administration, depending on who heads the agencies. There's at least as much variance, and I won't name names here despite your encouragement to do so, between heads of the DOJ at one stretch at the beginning versus the end, let us say, of the Obama administration or the Bush administrations. And that's an interesting observation too. I think a lot of the appointees may not have gone through a vetting process that elicits exactly how it is that they will behave once that they are head of the agency. And also there's a considerable amount of uncertainty about how they will behave. Many of them come from the defense bar, but nonetheless view themselves as more in a prosecutorial role when they get there, and that's unpredictable as well. So there's a huge variance, and I think it's partly because it is not an appointment that is as carefully vetted as perhaps it ought to be.
Have you noticed patterns of who you think defense bar, big law people can turn into tough enforcers? I mean, it's pretty notable that Cantor and Kahn have really different backgrounds. Yeah,
sure. So, well, I haven't done any systematic studies, so all I have is anecdotal evidence, and I think I'll pass on that question too. But there are quite reputable, responsible people who have taken over the agency from the defense bar, and I think done a credible job as they view their new role. But I think it's also true that if one doesn't live and breathe a lot of experiences from one perspective, it's really hard to bring the same energy toward a perspective that you're not familiar with, and don't live in prior to ascending to an important position in the agency. So I think one of the criticisms that Chad has comments, if not criticism, that Chad has made, is that Lena Khan obviously does not come from the defense bar or the plaintiff's bar. She's more an academic and has worked in think tanks and on the Hill, and that's a different perspective than typically a person ascends to chair of the FTC from. And I think that that is she has as a result a commitment to certain things that might not have persisted had she been in a different place, for better or worse.
Okay, I'm going to go to the audience in just a few minutes. and I will ask you to confine your comments to, or keep them short, comments and questions, more question than comment. But we have esteemed audience who can make learned comments, so I welcome those too. But I want to ask one last thing before I get to that, which is, so you could identify the hindrances to adequate enforcement. You could there are many plausible issues that are hindering enforcement. The courts, a revanchist court system, or at least a traditional conservative court system. You could think that maybe the leadership of the agencies has not been as productive as possible. Some people think that the academic, the IO field is hindering our knowledge and therefore our enforcement. Some people have identified the staff as reluctant to be real enforcers, especially the FTC staff, kind of revolting. Where does the panel locate the biggest hindrances to enforcement?
Our staff is fantastic. We need more of it. The biggest hindrance is budget. No, I'm only halfway joking. I'm joking a little bit, but that's the feasible lever that is at the margin. And in fact, we have gotten a little bit more budget. But as others have said, I think that's one way to move things forward.
I agree with that whole list, but let me just say, economists generally have been part of the problem, and I say that not with tongue-in-cheek, but I do think it's actually true. Someone once commented to me, someone who was involved in the case, that the worst thing that ever happened to antitrust enforcement in the courts was the Staples case. Now, the Staples case was, by all accounts, kind of brilliantly executed. Here we had, econometric evidence. We had newspaper ads from cities in Florida where there were 2 office superstores versus 1 or versus 3. But what it did was it convinced the courts, or at least some courts, that this kind of demonstration could be done in a lot of other cases. And it helped. It wasn't the only case that was responsible, but it sort of set a standard that judges were starting to look for proofs of consequences of mergers. And, economists, particularly in litigated cases, tend to promise a lot, and in some cases can deliver, but the temptation to overpromise or to criticize when, let us say, the government agency fails to deliver a specific prediction with lots of documentary as well as econometric evidence, that I think has proven to be an obstacle to successfully bringing cases. We can't prove a lot of these things to the satisfaction of the profession, much less the courts. This is one of the reasons, pardon me for circling back to this, but I think a certain category of cases, like coordinated effects cases, in particular, do not allow for that, except in a minority of circumstances. And as a result, we need to rethink how those cases are brought, but also we need to re-educate the courts as to what it is that realistically can be proven and what cannot be proven to the satisfaction of the courts in some instances. So I think the profession has, we have our toy models, which we love. Some of them are pretty good, but it leaves other parts of the law and other allegations and other concerns less well developed, and they look weak by comparison, at least to the uneducated judiciary.
All right. Shakespeare should have written, "First we should kill the economists." Okay, questions. Filippo, and then, Steve. Go ahead, Steve. No, sorry. Will you wait for microphone?
I haven't heard anything from the panel about deterrence. And DOJ, for example, you pointed out that DOJ's lost a bunch of cases, but you haven't talked at all about whether there have been positive deterrence effects from that. And, I would ask about both the no-poach and non-compete cases and also the litigating the fix merger cases. I mean, that's a brand new area. There's never been systematic group of litigating the fix cases before, and the law is still working out. And the only way the law can get worked out is if you bring cases, win or lose. So I'd like to hear all of your comments about deterrence.
Yeah, an excellent point. The kind of the bully pulpit, the proposed new rules on non-competes. How do we see deterrence, especially in mergers that didn't happen? How do we measure that?
So actually, this brings to mind your question. Oh, there's been some losses, but what often doesn't get counted is how many mergers have been abandoned. And some of them we know, and some of them we don't even know because they abandoned even before they came to us. So that I think that's an area of scholarship. If there was a way to measure that, I think that'd be pretty interesting, and it's surely there. But we'd like to know more. In the realm of no poach in particular, we have had a string of cases, and the juries, decided against, counting this as an offense, and it's, we can't control juries. But it's very important that every time we pass the motion to dismiss, meaning that the judge said, if proven, this is a per se violation of the antitrust laws. And having these decisions, I think, plausibly plays a very big deterrent effect because that has clarified, the law, and hopefully, employers are on alert that this is not okay. So I think, and even though we lost, importantly, in those cases because the jury decided otherwise, so I think that's quite important.
Can we get beyond an anecdotal assessment of deterrence, Martin?
My co-author is gonna get very angry at me for spilling the beans on a paper that's not online yet, but. So on 19th of October, when Jonathan Kender made the interlock announcement.
Martin, speaking into the mic.
Whoops. When the announcement came about the interlocks being enforced, you see a strong negative stock market reaction of firms in the same industry that have interlocks compared to other firms. It looks pretty cool, I must say. So my point is, it seems like the shareholders get the message that they can continue as usual, and whether it counts as more than anecdotes or not, the referees will decide. But something happened.
Okay. Yes, Filippo. Or
Thanks. I think Chad in his opening remarks made a good summary of the evidence that used to justify more enforcement, right? The markups, productivity, labor share, etc. I wanted to ask you and then everyone else, what do you think is the weakest evidence on the absolute level? And what do you think is the evidence that has the least connection with potential antitrust enforcement? And then whether people agree with his views. Those I'm curious.
Not specific papers, you're talking about like elements of the case that is weak?
Yeah.
One thing I would have thought was reasonably strong before was the dynamism stuff, but if you look at the data, dynamism has actually turned around since COVID. We've had a huge increase in the foundation of companies in the US, also lesser so, but in that direction in the EU. Labor market dynamism has increased, and there has been no turning point in antitrust enforcement. I don't know if there's been a turning point in margins, so we'll see. I do agree with Martin's point that, hey, costs matter too. It's not just P minus C, it's what C is. And productivity growth had been slow. I think, though, we haven't established whether the common ownership affects costs or not. We know it affects the incentives of executives, but we haven't quite tied that to costs yet. But I do want to say that that's important. So dynamism would have been an element of the case that I think is now backed off a little bit. I think the biggest issue is kind of all of that is explained also by a change in technology towards higher fixed cost, lower marginal cost stuff, and a fair amount of which you might think has nothing to do with policy at all. Like there was a new way of doing business that was part and parcel to a whole bunch of things. And in that case, again, even if markups rise in equilibrium, that's not a policy matter. That's the way the universe turned out. I don't know if that alternative view has been squashed.
does any of the panelists disagree with that or identify other weaker elements of it? No? Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Tommaso Valletti, I'm an economist based in London. I want to push back on something that Chad said. So I understand that the role of Chad on the panel was being skeptical and push back on the other participants to the panel. But at some stage, Chad, you said that we are expecting in many markets to observe that the lowest quality-adjusted price to emerge. So this leads to concentration, even monopolization, and this is something that we want to encourage. And I want to push back on two grounds. One is, if you are skeptical on the evidence that others are bringing on concentration, markups, etc., where is the evidence for your claim applied to the markets we are talking about? So we are talking about what is the evidence that Monsanto is the most efficient firm, that AT&T is the most efficient firm, that CVS Health is the most efficient firm. This systematic evidence doesn't exist. So by the same standard, the point, Chad, let me finish. The point I'm making is that the standards we are asking the other camp to provide should also be applicable to other arguments, so that in any market we observe the most efficient firms. That's a big claim, and the evidence in antitrust markets, I'm not talking about the average market in the economy, I'm talking about the specific markets in antitrust. This evidence doesn't exist. Systematic evidence, the same thing. Even if I take for granted, this is my second part of the comment to push back, it's part of this conversation. Even if I accept that argument, and I would like to know with this systematic scientific evidence, where is that? Imagine I accept that it exists. I'm not sure I would want that if, by promoting this monopolization, then the new firms give up, okay? So if those efficiencies, alleged efficiencies, don't turn into any consumer benefits, only to monopolization. So even from a strict IO point of view, I would say I prefer, in many circumstances, some degree of an inefficiency, as long as this drives to competition, which brings good benefits to consumers, as opposed to this generic claim that everything which is observed, the Dempsey's argument, everything is great for whom? Okay, this is where I would like to push back.
Just to finish on the Dempsey's argument isn't that everything is great, it's that you don't know whether everything's great just by looking at concentration. Could be it's getting worse, but so it's a value neutral interpretation of concentration. That's what I would say about that. Now, there is an enormous literature of productivity that shows, on average, markets reallocate activity towards more efficient firms. For a while, there was a problem with that literature in that we basically price leaked into our measure of output, and so maybe they look more efficient, but really what happened is their price went up. That's been, people have been working to address that for 15 years. I would say, in general, the tenor of the evidence is the same. When I talked about the trade literature, there's a huge number of trade papers, for example, that shows you lower trade barriers, you get this reallocation. I've looked at it in other specific industries. You are right. That literature, for various sociological reasons, has never cared to actually look specifically at merger effects. There are a few papers that have looked at the productivity effects of mergers, but not very many. I've lamented that with some of my colleagues lately, that it wasn't a priority. We should do more on mergers and productivity effects. But if you want to say, what is my view of the expected, well, I don't know about mergers, but do markets on average reallocate activity when working well? When you actually, within a market, as you change barriers to substitution, you make it easier for consumers to switch from whom they're buying, we typically find, and by typically I mean mostly always, that the market starts reallocating activity towards those that we measure as being more productive. So I'm going to take the perspective that even if we're not looking at markets that will in the future merge, that is the way they're working. I think that explains US manufacturing over the last 30 years. I think it explains retail. I don't think it explains other sectors. They have market power issues. I'm not trying to say every market that's concentrated has gotten better, because again, that's not what Dempsey et al. Said either. It's just that you can't look at concentration and view that as the end-all view, metric of the amount of competition.
Yes.
So I have a suggestion and a question. The suggestion is, for Martin and John, I think you should write a paper looking at the price effect of mergers as a result of common ownership before. And so if Martin is right, you should see this price effect going down, but not because mergers have become better, it's because no mergers have become worse. And you have some cross-section, so I think there is some endogeneity, but I'm sure Martin is going to figure out how to deal with that. The question is for Chad, because you said that in the long run, productivity is everything, and now it's true, in the long run we're all dead, but let's take it that that's right. In the long run, productivity is everything.
Not as for our kids and grandkids, even after we're dead.
I understand, but if we in the meantime suffer tremendously, it's not obvious that there is an intertemporal welfare consideration. I love about my great-grandkids, but I think we should also care about the current generation. Anyway, let's take that as granted. And then you said there is basically no evidence that antitrust has anything to do with productivity. So I want to draw the conclusion, and tell me if I'm wrong. You're saying that we should give up on antitrust because it doesn't impact. So what does let me ask a different way. Okay. In what way antitrust should help, given that you're saying it doesn't help productivity, and so what can it help?
No, that's what I was trying to address when I said, I think that actually the marginal case probably has positive expected value. I'm just saying when you add it all up, do I think it's going to be percentage points per year boost to growth? No way. I don't know we have evidence that it's going to add up to tenths of a percentage point. I'll take it. I think it's positive. The question is, how big is it? And how much can you turn even if you turn the antitrust dial all the way to where the marginal case has zero social value, how much does productivity growth increase there? I don't know what it is, but I'll bet it's not a percentage point per year. That's all I'm saying.
There are very few things that can change productivity.
But general purpose technologies do. That is kind of my point.
I would add we have a lot of economic policy that, no matter what they state, doesn't affect productivity growth, and we find it valuable either way.
I said I like it. It's a good law. We should do more of it. Right? I'm not arguing with antitrust enforcement, or even that on the margin we could do more.
All right, I'll go to Carl, and then Matt, you can throw a bomb in afterwards. Here, Carl had a question. Pass it over to them. And I didn't realize we were going to have an attack on effective altruism in this. Where's Sam Bankman-Fried when you need him? Okay, Carl.
So my question is about merger retrospectives, so it goes first to John. And since this panel is about overall economy, I guess I'm a believer that merger enforcement overall has not been strong enough, and we have various industries where we see that, healthcare, hospitals, for example. But you're making a broader claim that it's very broad for the whole, have substantial effects based on merger retrospectives, and I just feel like you're pushing that more than the evidence shows. So I want to feel you out on where you really think. In your book and in your 2015 article, there are only 4 mergers that you report in your meta-study, merger retrospective, since the year 2000. The only one with a meaningful price increase is Whirlpool Maytag, and believe me, I know a lot about that. I was a DOJ expert, and many people at the time said that was bad. The Herfindahl was through the roof. So you're not really putting forward evidence, broad-based evidence from merger retrospectives, but you seem to be claiming to do so. Could you clarify that?
Sure. Dennis Carlton said it was good. We reported that in our story. But John, can you respond?
My first response is some puzzlement, because there certainly were many more than 4 merger retrospectives. I think 4 may have been discussed in particular, but those were illustrative. Oh, in the year since in the last 22 years? No, I'm not. We would have to. You would have to identify that. The merger retrospective literature that I had 60 studies and had about 46 different mergers. Some of them were duplicative, and so there were a fair number of mergers that went into that database, and it was the summary statistics and also the disaggregation that I reported on. So it's not just 4. So with all respect, Carl, you and I need to chat later about what it is you're referencing. I certainly not drawing conclusions from 4 data points. Let me just make that clear. But in all of my work, I've made very clear that while I believe there's large value to merger retrospectives, by no means do I think that there are enough of them out there. These are hard for academics to do. I've done a couple of them myself. They're very resource intensive. They're difficult for outsiders to do. I think the agencies are in a unique position, as I said before, to do this, and the reason they're not doing them, in short, is resources. I think, Joanna and I and everyone else knows that the agencies are resource strapped, and it affects almost everything they do. What cases they bring, how many cases they bring, what investigations they run, and yes, what research they have the resources to pursue. And it's unfortunate that those choices have to be made, because the mission of the agencies is a meritorious one. Having to make these sort of choices is like triaging in a hospital. It is unfortunate that this has to be done. So the merger retrospective program that Joe Simon started, really has not gotten off the ground. There's some modest reporting that's being done, but much more does need to be done. So I've been cautious, even with the 45 or 60 studies, not to exaggerate what they do say. What I began by saying today is that I think that the comparison, this enforcement gap that I reported on, creates a hypothesis about what's going on. It's not a conclusion, but a hypothesis that does need more data points. But it's easy. It's too easy to say, well, we need more data. I'm not looking to articulate something here that everybody would agree with. I think we need to identify what looks to be interesting and likely possibilities from the data we do have, not 4, but 40 or 60 observations. At least is no longer anecdotes. One of the reasons I started compiling merger retrospectives that I was involved in various capacities with the agencies and as an outside consultant with cases where parties would come in and say, well, we've done a retrospective on this or that comparable merger, and here's what it says. And I kept saying, well, wait a minute, that's one example. What does the sum total of all retrospectives tell us about the outcomes of actual mergers? And from that, I sort of launched the exercise to compile all of these to see what, in sum total, they did produce. So there were 60 individual studies. There are hundreds of other mergers that were evaluated in groups. And so my book kind of talks about not just the individual studies, but individual mergers and individual studies, but also the aggregations. And the sum total of these is literally in the hundreds of examples. But all of these have strengths and weaknesses, which I do document, and I thought I was appropriately cautious in the way that I presented them. Carl, you and I need to chat.
All right, I want to go to Matt. Last question. Did you have a question? And then we'll. Oh, you did. Oh, okay. Great. Last question, and then we'll break. We'll go over a little bit.
Well, it's a question and a comment indeed. I'll join the Italian corner. I want to follow on something that Tommaso and Luigi say. I'm Christina. I'm a practitioner. I come from Europe, so I'm an observer to this discussion. What is striking to me, though, is that in a sense, I do not understand how we can be here in 2023 having this kind of discussion. Chad, what you set out there as a benchmark is still this kind of rhetoric or narrative that says, well, how can this stuff change points of GDP, even 0.1%? Where is the evidence that it can? And I find it a bit of a dissonance, because I don't think anyone I know is claiming that antitrust enforcement will move GDP in a positive direction by a massive amount. No one is claiming that what is missing is capable of doing that. No one is claiming that under-enforcement is only responsible or the only responsible factor for a lot of ailments. I think everybody knows that there are lots of other factors and contributing element, superstar firms, technology, all of this is taken in. That said, I think, as you say, we have under-enforced. I don't think anyone can be in doubt about that. You say, well, it's cute. Let's do a little bit more of it. It'll do something at the margin. What is the downside of taking this a little bit more seriously and saying, well, we've under-enforced, my evidence is mostly anecdotal because I'm in the trenches, and I can tell you that there is a lot of evidence in direct cases that I do where you have actually consolidated and prices have gone up, margins have gone up, outcomes have been worse, and I can mention multiple industries that Tommaso knows well in Europe. It isn't a generalized phenomenon, but again, let's not kind of overclaim. It's a sense that we are kind of knocking down a claim that no one is making. It's a bit of a straw man. There is no question that there are sectors in which performance has worsened as a result of, or together with concentration going forward. So what's the downside? We have been paralyzed by type 1 error. Let's not over-enforce in case what? So yes, deterrence, the PE firms are scared. I know it from being in the room. They're saying, let's not do these deals. The CMA scared the daylight out of people. They're not doing many deals in the UK. What's the downside? Exactly. We don't do 3, 4, 5 deals a year. What happens? I mean, I'm interested in your view.
Right.
What happens?
Chad, you have the last word then to answer that question. And there was a kind of tone of sort of thinking this was kind of acute, a little bit dismissive. So how do you respond to that?
Okay, well, it's good I know I came across that way. I didn't mean to be cute. So maybe I'm reading the literature and the conversation incorrectly. I thought some people did think there were macroeconomic effects of antitrust policy. I thought that was the reason why the session was called Antitrust Effects, the U.S. economy. But maybe I missed the memo on that. Fine. If I am wrong about that, then we agree. We 100% agree. I said on the margin, it's probably going to have a positive value to enforce more. All I said is in the end, I don't know of evidence, happy to have my mind changed, I'm not against the notion, that it will have large macroeconomic effects. I want growth to go up by any means that will make it do it. And to the extent that I sounded cute, or I didn't mean to be knocking down a straw man. I thought that was a man out there that was worth knocking down that wasn't straw. But again, if people view it that way, fine, I apologize for having set up the straw man. That's not what I meant to do.
No apology necessary. Thank you. In fact, thanks to all of you. I think this has been a great discussion. I hope people enjoyed it. And it's going to be a great day.